we might have a few people still coming in. I hope that those of you sitting in the back will be able to see the slides up here. Good. Okay. Last week, we talked about introductory issues relating to the theological development from polytheism and the rise of the Christian community as a normalization under the Roman Empire, Constantine and all that. And we talked about the life of Muhammad as sort of within the context of the developing questions that the Christian community had been debating over issues such as, what do we talk about when we talk about the Trinity? And how does the Trinity, how do we understand that relationship within itself? And then also the issue of Christology, so Trinitarian controversy, the Christological controversy. How do we understand Christ and the person of Jesus? And how does this God thing and human thing work within the person of Jesus? And what I tried to lay out was the fighting that went on within the early Christian community over these issues. I mean, it was bloody battles, bloody wars, people declaring heretics all over the place. What was viewed as orthodoxy kept changing so that the orthodox position would declare the other side to be heretical, and then the other side would have a moment of power and they declare the other side heretical. How this then provides the background for understanding some of what we'll talk about when we take a look at Muhammad and the theological texts. Now, one thing that I want to mention, today we're going to be looking at the stories of Adam and Eve in the garden, and how this is reflected both in the biblical tradition itself, how it gets reworked in Christian tradition, and how it gets reworked in Islamic tradition. Now, if in the Bible, we have it pretty easy because more or less, the Bible is in chronological order. You know, it begins with creation, goes through Adam, and then all of the ancestral traditions, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Sarah and all the rest. And then it goes into Moses and the history of Israel. There's some dislocation then when you come to the prophets, because then now you're starting with the earliest prophets. But even the prophetic literature, more or less, is chronologically arranged. Then you finally get to wisdom literature or the writings, and they're not so chronological. But at least the main part of that stuff has been chronological, so that if you want to take a look at the stories of Adam and Eve, you're not going to look at the end of the book, you're going to look at the beginning of the book. And that's where you'll find those stories. Now, the stories of Adam and Eve will be referenced in other places in the biblical tradition. But I mentioned last week that if you were to break out a concordance and look at issues such as the names Adam, Eve, Eden, that sort of thing, you'd be surprised at how little attention there is paid to these traditions within the Old Testament tradition itself. There is some, but not a lot, surprisingly little. But it's chronological. Now, if you turn to the Quran, I was talking with someone a few minutes ago who has a copy of the Quran, and they said they had trouble finding where Adam is. You can't turn to the beginning of the book because the Quran is not set up chronologically. I mentioned last week that there are 114 surahs, or 114 chapters in the Quran, and they basically, except for Surah 1, which is an introductory prayer asking for right guidance, the rest of them are set up basically according to length of the material. So the longer surahs are in the front, and as you go on, they get shorter and shorter. And I also mentioned that the shorter surahs are the more pungent ones where these revelations are basically warning people about the destruction that is coming their way, those are generally pegged as or regarded as the Meccan surahs, recall. That is, the surahs that Muhammad revealed or were revealed to Muhammad in his Meccan period, early in his life, from the years, recall from last week, he started receiving these oracles. According to Islamic tradition, he started receiving these oracles in about 610 on the Night of Power. And he was in Mecca from 610 until, well, he was born and raised in Mecca, but he stayed there until 622 when they had the Hijrah, where he moved to Medina. So from the years 610 to 622, we're talking about these Meccan oracles, or Meccan surahs. And then after 622, the last 10 years of his life, 622 to 632, were spent in Medina. Those are the Medinan oracles. The Meccan oracles are from the period of time when Muhammad was locked in bitter argumentation with his enemies, the Meccans. He was not well regarded in those early years in Mecca. And he was locked in battle with his fellow Arabs who were still jealously protecting their own religious convictions around polytheism. And Muhammad regarded himself as a reformer, and he was making people mad. And so these shorter, pungent oracles from his earlier period now are at the end of the Quran, or the last, let's say, half of the Quran. When he is at Medina, he is now giving shape to the emerging Muslim community from 622 to 632. And so he is much more reflective. The oracle, the surahs are longer, and they tend to be much more instructive. And now they may have to do with the broader theological conversation that he is conducting among Jews and Christians. And so the you might say anti-Jewish, anti-Christian polemic in the Quranic tradition tends to emerge from the later period in Muhammad's life, but those are the longer oracles, more reflective. They're now first in the Quran. So that's the first thing to recognize, is that it's not chronological. The second thing is that if you're looking at for any particular person, like Adam, like Noah, like Moses, like Elijah, they're there, but you can't expect them to appear in some sort of a chronological sequence. What happens is that the oracles or the revelations come to Muhammad usually around a particular topic. And while Muhammad is reflecting on this topic, or Muslims would not say that Muhammad is reflecting on a topic. Muslims would say that God is revealing the oracle to Muhammad, and the divine voice then reveals to Muhammad, on this topic, compare so-and-so. Think about Adam. Think about Noah. Think about Moses. And so you'll have the biblical stories brought up in shorter snippets as illustrative of a particular topic that happens to be under discussion. So you may have references to Moses or Noah or anybody else in that surah, and that surah, and that surah, and that surah, and that surah. Whenever that topic lends itself to being illustrated by referencing a biblical story. So that's why you are not going to be able to go to, like in the Bible, Genesis 1 to 3, to read the foundational tradition regarding Adam. So we have to keep that in mind. I want to, there it is, try this thing out. I want to begin by taking a look at Adam and Eve in the garden in a biblical perspective. As soon as I can get this to work. There it is. some of the basic assumptions about the creation of the human in the book of Genesis, in our biblical story. The biblical view is that Adam is in the image of God, the imago, created in the imago Dei, the Tselem V'Demut of God. And this is an important aspect of what it means to be human. Also, something that I think often gets overlooked is that when Adam is created in Genesis chapter 1, I believe that it is understood to be a unique action of creation. Think about the biblical story of creation. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God said, "Let there be such and such. Let there be a firmament. Let the earth produce." So all of these are commands given to the nature in general, let there be light, or given to the earth to bring forth. But when you hit Genesis 1:26, there's a fundamental shift in the grammar that I think is intended to indicate that we're on something new here. This is the creation of the human being, and there is a pronounced grammatical shift, and we're all familiar with this language, but it doesn't get commented on very often. And God said, "Let us make humankind in our image." It's a shift from what in Hebrew would be called the jussive voice to the cohortative voice, where now the command is not going out to nature in general or to the ground to produce. The command is directed within the divine self. Let us make humankind according to our image. And so I think that grammatical shift signals what in the biblical tradition is understood to be a unique act of creation in God making humankind in the divine image. However, in the biblical tradition, I find it interesting that there is, to some extent, a demotion of the human from that image. Consider, for example, the language of Psalm 8, verses 4 through 6. What is humankind that you are mindful of him and that you care for him, but yet you have made him ma'at melohim, is the Hebrew text, little less than God. Little less than God. Right up there. And how that gets reworked. We were talking about the reworking of traditions. When the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew text, when that Septuagint gets translated, instead of saying little less than Elohim, God, the Septuagint takes that as little less than gods. And the way the Septuagint usually deals with potentially polytheistic language, or I don't even know what you would call it, the plural language, the plural aspects of the divine, they will translate that as angels, angeloi. So in the Septuagint, it gets translated, "Yet you have made him little less than the angels," which is very interesting, as we'll see when we come to the Quranic tradition. So in the biblical tradition, Adam and Eve are created little less than God. In the Greek tradition, which is what the Christian tradition uses, because the Christian community basically didn't speak Hebrew anymore. They were switching to Greek, and so they used the Septuagint as their Bible. They're familiar with the language, "You made him little less than the angels." So I find this demotion rather interesting. The creation of Adam in the Quranic view. In the Quranic view, Adam is not special. He is paradigmatic of all of creation, because all of creation, this would be some of the main stresses in the Islamic tradition, all of creation is Muslim. To be Muslim means to be obedient, to follow the will of God. And all creation, essentially, by nature, according to the Islamic tradition, is Muslim. Secondly, there's a real resistance in the Islamic tradition to imaging deity. Muslims would be very uncomfortable thinking of humans as being created in the image of God because God cannot be imaged. One of the things I tried to stress last week was that God is so apart from creation that the worst thing you can do is to associate anything with God. Association, shirk, is the chief sin in the Islamic tradition. And so to speak of anything as being in the image of God would really tread on dangerous territory in Islamic theology. So Islam resists the notion of thinking of humans as being created in the image of God. Adam is not a unique act of creation. Rather, Adam is simply created in the Quranic tradition by God simply saying, be. Like God says of everything else, let there be light. Let there be a firmament. And that language is also then used of Adam in the Quranic tradition. God didn't have to go through a special action of creation and begetting somebody. For God's sake, God doesn't beget. God simply says, be. So you see how that language is morphed in the Islamic tradition to stress the fact that Adam is simply typical of all of creation in general. Everything was created by God simply saying be. However, the last bullet point up here, Adam is endowed immediately with complete wisdom and was taught in chapter 2 or Surah 2:31, for example, Adam is taught the names of everything. God teaches Adam the names of everything. Well, we can obviously see here a reflex of the tradition that we know in Genesis chapter 2, where, recall, Adam doesn't have a partner suitable, and so God creates or brings all of the animals before Adam, and Adam names the animals. But still, even after all of the animals are named, there isn't a suitable helper found for Adam, and so Eve is created out of Adam's rib. So this, I think, is a reflex of that story where now it's not that Adam comes up with the names of the animals. It's that God teaches Adam all of the names of everything. In other words, the Muslim tradition understands this to be rather complete knowledge. Adam is fully gifted with intellectual prowess early on in his life. And so this is an important point in Islamic tradition. And in this regard, then, one of the first dramas that happens in the stories of Adam and Eve in the Quran is that this leads to a battle between God and the angels, or the jinn. We talked last week about the jinn. I don't want to go there yet. We talked last week about the jinn. The story in the Quran is that once God teaches Adam the names of everything, God wants to sort of show off the divine handiwork and invites the angels to come and say, hey, do you know what this is all about? And they say, no, how can we know? And God says, well, Adam knows, because I just taught him. Bow down to Adam because he is your superior. He knows all of this, and you are to bow to Adam. Well, there is one among this group variously regarded as an angel, or probably more in the Islamic tradition, one of the jinn, who refuses to bow down before Adam because this angel or this jinn says, I'm not going to bow down to this Johnny-come-lately. I was here first. He ought to be bowing down to me. And this, of course, then is the backdrop for the story we'll talk in a bit, the expulsion of this particular angel or this particular jinn, whose name in the Islamic tradition is Iblis, from heaven. Iblis probably is derived from the Greek term diabolos. I think scholars would argue that. But it's Iblis in the Quranic tradition. So the creation of the garden in the biblical tradition. Good, bad, and the tree of knowledge. This then sets up, Genesis 1, of course, is the story in a later tradition called the priestly tradition of the creation of the world. But then when you hit chapter 2, you've got the first 4 verses that sort of finish up that story. But then in chapter 2, verse 4b, you begin a different story that focuses now upon God creating Adam out of the mud, breathing the divine breath into Adam, and putting Adam in a garden that God has created, and the creation of the trees, and the story of Adam and Eve in the garden with the trees. What I want to take a look at here is how I think this story is appropriated to really heighten the guilt of Adam, and in Christian tradition, especially the guilt of Eve, because the Christian tradition was not very kind to Eve eventually. But if you look at the biblical text, what is it that is said about the trees? That they are created as pleasant to the sight and good for food. And the creation of the trees in the middle of the garden, there's some confusion, but there are 2 trees that figure prominently, the tree of wisdom and the tree the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of life. And they're both apparently located somewhere in the middle of the garden. But they too share in this same category, because when Eve struggles with whether to eat the fruit or not, the text says that she sees that, using this exact same language, when she sees that the trees were delightful, pleasant to the sight, and good for food, to be cherished, to make one wise, she takes and eats. So my take on this is that the reader is not supposed to assume that the tree that was off limits was somehow marked out in neon lights. That, you could see the warning lights going off. She has this debate with the snake, and she sees that the trees share in the very marks of divine blessing. And who is she to argue that the marks of divine blessing in these trees are any different than in those trees? And besides that they're pleasant to the sight, they're good for food, make one wise. What are we expecting that Eve would do? So I think that it's to, in a sense, place us in the garden and make us aware that these sorts of moral conundrums are not usually easily resolved. Now the trees are the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Well, technically the Hebrew does not say good and evil. If it did, it would be tov v'rasha, but it's tov v'ra, which means good and bad. And so scholars suggest, well, maybe that means everything, the knowledge of everything, complete knowledge, or of moral discernment or something like that, the ability to think philosophically. And important is the role of the snake in the garden. The snake is referred to at the beginning of chapter 2, where this story begins, or chapter 3, where this story begins. It's interesting that chapter 2 ends with the words that Adam and Eve were arum. They were naked. And chapter 3 begins with the word, now the serpent, the snake, was the most arum of any of God's creatures. And so the reader, I think, is, wait a minute, is the snake naked? Or how do I read that? Well, it's a slightly different take on the word, which means in this case, crafty, sneaky. The snake was the craftiest of all of God's creatures. The snake was a creature, but it was the craftiest of all of God's creatures. The snake in the garden is not yet Satan. We'll take a look at that in a moment. That is a later connection. And the snake is not singled out for blame. Recall how that goes. Adam, what did you do? Adam says, it was the woman, and you gave her to me. And Adam is blaming everything that he can. God says, Eve, what's the story? And she says, it was what's left. It was the snake that did this. And so God doesn't even give the snake a chance to pass the buck. The snake immediately is cursed by God, and then the curse goes to Eve, and then the curse goes to Adam. So all of the characters share in their culpability of this event. God's warning, and this is, I think, critical for what I would consider to be the biblical or the Old Testament version of the story. The significance of Genesis 3:22. If you have a Bible, I know, probably not. Take me a while to flip these thin pages to find Genesis. But for me, Genesis 3:22 is sort of the kicker. When I was teaching and I finally focused in on this verse, and I thought, yeah, this has got to be fundamental for understanding this text. What does it say that Genesis 3:22 says? This is after Adam and Eve have eaten of the fruit. Then the Lord God said, see, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now he might reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore the Lord God sent them forth from the garden. So it seems to me to be an obvious reference that we've misunderstood what's going on, at least in the story at this level, that Adam and Eve made it to the tree of knowledge and were imbued with divine wisdom. They have become like one of us, knowing whatever good and evil means, or good and bad, and knowing everything, complete wisdom. And now it's possible they could make it also to the tree of life and live forever, and that, my friends, would be intolerable. And we can't have that. So, for that reason, Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden. In other words, the biblical story seems to me to suggest that they made it to the tree of wisdom, never made it to the tree of eternal life, of immortality. And the story gets reappropriated, as we'll see in a moment. But also, humans, so what does this mean? I think that the story was intended to talk about the human experience. What is it that makes us human? It's not to talk about what happened with Adam and Eve. It's to talk about what is it that makes us Because Adam means humankind. What is it that makes us Adam? What is it that makes us human? And I think the story is trying to tell us that it has something to do with the fact that the acquisition of wisdom is not only life-giving, but it is also death-dealing. Because humans alone, I think this is the key, humans alone, unlike our dogs Max and Emmy, or your cat, whatever it might be named, they don't seem to have any awareness that they're doomed. It seems to be uniquely a part of the human condition to know that what has wisdom brought us? Wisdom has brought us the awareness of our mortality. That's what it means to be human. And our mortality is symbolized then by the nakedness that Adam and Eve recognize once their eyes are opened, and they're gifted with this divine wisdom, if you can call it a gift, that they are naked, they are mud, they are mortal, they are going to die. And that's what wisdom ends up bringing to the human condition. But I don't think it's all bad news, because the alternative would be for humans to not only stay mortal, but for humans to stay stupid. And at least we can celebrate the fact that according to these stories, which are shared among other Near Eastern stories, that we've been imbued with divine wisdom. We have the mind of God, but that mind of God is trapped in a body of mud. And that's the human condition. So I think it's a wonderful story, the metaphor of what it means to be human. But the other part of the good news is that Adam and Eve are repatriated to the ground from which they were taken. Adam was created from the mud of the Adamah, the ground, and placed in Eden, in this garden. And he was given the task to till and keep. But what is there to till and keep in Eden? It's not until Adam is repatriated to the ground from which he was taken, where he's going to have to be fighting weeds and thistles all his life, where the words to tend, to cultivate, to preserve, where that has any meaning whatsoever. So in a sense, I think that when Adam is repatriated to the ground from which he was taken, it's there that we understand this is where we belong. This is where our divine mission has some significance in tending and gardening, beating the weeds of life back. Now, it's interesting that in Genesis chapters 2 and 3, there's no sense that the garden is anywhere but somewhere in the east, the text says. But at some point, either before or after the Genesis text, the thought was that this garden of God is somewhere up in heaven, a special place. And when Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden, they're in a sense cast out of this heavenly realm where they could walk shoulder to shoulder with God, and they're thrown down to earth. I have a text here from Ezekiel and another post-biblical text or pseudepigraphal text from 2nd Esdras, which talks about the fact that there was this tradition, late and probably later, that Eden was found up in some heavenly realm somewhere, and that Adam and Eve were cast to the ground. But that doesn't seem to me to be implied in the story in Genesis 2 and 3 itself. Now let's talk a little bit about the figure of Satan, and I'm going to have to buzz through. Okay, turn it around. Let's get it pointed the right way. There. I'm going to buzz through this stuff quickly. Satan in biblical tradition, because I already said that the snake is not Satan. The word Satan is never used of the snake in Genesis chapters 2 and 3. Sorry? Go forward. You went back to your original. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I can't figure out which is the... Okay, that's got to be the front. Satan. There. Okay, thank you. The first thing to say is that when you do a concordance search of the word Satan, the Hebrew word Satan in the Old Testament tradition, it's hardly ever used of a non-human being. It's almost always used of humans, whether adversaries or as accusers. So, for example, Solomon has his enemies, David has his enemies, the psalmist has his accusers, but it's always understood to be humans. A Satan is a human accuser or a human adversary, enemy. In one text, fairly early, I think, Numbers chapter 22, there's this weird story about Balaam's talking ass. Have you ever heard this story? Okay. In this story, Balaam is on his way supposedly to curse Israel, but God doesn't want him to curse Israel. He wants him to bless Israel. And so God sends an angel as a Satan to stop Balaam from doing this. And it's a cute little story about how the angel as Satan, Balaam Satan, positions himself in a rock and refuses to let Balaam ride by on his donkey until finally the Satan positions himself in a way that the ass can't get through and lies down. And Balaam starts beating him, and then the ass starts talking to Balaam. Why did you do that? And the story it unfolds. It's not even regarded as peculiar that the donkey is talking. It's a funny story, but in any event, just to illustrate that in this fairly early text out of Numbers, the Satan is an angel. Well, that's not far from what eventually develops. In later texts in the biblical tradition, Zechariah 3, Job chapters 1 to 2, the Satan is part of God's assembly. If you read Job 1 and 2, God calls the B'nai Elohim, the children of God, or the sons of God, or the divine council, let's say, together, and among them is the Satan. And God singles out the Satan and says, "Hey, where you been, buddy?" And the guy says, "Oh, I've been doing what I'm instructed to do. I've been walking back and forth in the world, getting the goods on people," because the Satan is the divine prosecuting attorney, the one who accuses, brings accusations. And so God says, "Well, what'd you find?" And Satan, God starts a bet with Satan. Says, "Hey, have you noticed my buddy Job?" And there it begins. And we probably know the story of Job and what that bet that God makes with Satan regarding whether Job is really faithful or just living out from all of the goodies that he's gotten, how that all unfolds. So here again, Satan is a part of the divine council, who is God's prosecuting attorney on earth and is the one responsible for ratting out human beings in the divine council. But there is a tradition that develops about Satan as fallen from heaven. And where in the world does this tradition come from? Well, Genesis 6, 1-4 is a strange story. Hardly anyone ever knows this story about the Nephilim. Naphal means to fall. And the Nephilim are the original inhabitants or related to the original inhabitants of the land. And it's a story about how the Nephilim get into trouble. And this is taken up later on in the New Testament, for example, in the book of Jude. Another text that I find very interesting is in Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 following, which rehearses an ancient myth known from the Ugaritic texts. I think I mentioned Ugarit last week. Several hundred years even before David, so centuries before these texts came into existence. There was this myth recorded in the Ugaritic texts, part of Canaanite mythology, in which this god named Ophtar, who represents the morning star phase of the planet Venus, tries to usurp Baal's throne. Remember from last week, Baal was the hero god who had defeated the power of sea. But there's another story about how Baal tries to fight against Mot, the god of death, and is killed and spends some period of time, as typical of ancient Near Eastern mythologies, where a god spends part of the year in death. Well, Baal spends some time in the realm of Mot, and while he's gone, this god Ophtar thinks, ooh, Baal's throne is empty. I think I'll try and take that over. But Ophtar's short, and he tries to sit on Baal's throne, but he can't fit on it, and he's laughed off of the throne and sent packing back to where he belongs in humiliation. So this ancient myth of Ophtar at Ugarit, whom we know from Ugarit, is taken up in Isaiah 14 as a taunt song. Now, how Isaiah came upon this old story of Ophtar, I don't know, but he had to have had access to it somewhere. And in this text, in Isaiah 14, this story of the humiliation of Ophtar is now applied to the I think it's Babylon, the king of Babylon, who would aspire to the heights of heaven, but is sent packing. Let me read this text in Isaiah 14. Getting there. These pages are so thin. 13. Oh, come on. Okay, there's 14. Chapters or verses 12 following. This is the taunt song spoken against the king. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. Remember, Ophtar was the representative of the morning star, Venus in its morning star phase. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of assembly on the heights of Zaphon. I will ascend to the tops of the clouds, make myself like the most high. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the depths of the pit. And on it goes. So you have this story of day star, son of the dawn, Venus, the morning star, who tries to usurp God's throne, but is sent down in humiliation. Now, this figure, this story, eventually gets associated with a name that we well know. In the Greek, the Hebrew, Shachar Halel, or I can't remember what it is right now, but it gets translated in the Greek as Heospheros, as bearer of light. And this gets translated then in the Latin Vulgate as Luciferos, Lucifer. And so we have this interesting story from ancient mythology at Ugarit that you can trace down until we can see how it becomes associated with the story of the fall of Lucifer from heaven. And one other text I want to call attention to is 1 Chronicles 21:1 as opposed to 2 Samuel 24. In 2 Samuel, both of these, we have the story of David who is instructed by God to take a census of Israel. But then when David takes the census, that was a no-no thing to do, and so God smacks Israel for David having taken the census. Well, wait a minute, time out. That doesn't make any sense, right? For God to give David a command and then smacks him for having done it. And one can see that what happens is in the later text, 1 Chronicles 21, by now, we're talking so late in the biblical tradition, that the figure of Satan has developed through Job and all of that. So now the author of 1 Chronicles 21 makes a little switch and says that it wasn't God that instructed David to take a census. It was Satan who instructed David to take the census. So you can see that by this late period of time, the figure of Satan had become so real in biblical tradition that the author of 1 Chronicles could make the switch and argue that this figure of Satan had inspired David to take the census. In the New Testament, we have a few texts. Luke 10 reports that Jesus sees Satan falling from heaven. I think that by now, by the time of Jesus, we have Satan as a fairly well-developed character. And Jesus sees Satan falling from heaven. In Jude chapter 1, verse 6, it's reflecting upon that story of the Nephilim back in Genesis 6, 1-4. And it says that these were fallen angels who did not stay in their appropriate position, locked in prison in hell. So these angels had not maintained their appropriate place. They had stepped out of where they belong. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul refers to Satan as disguising himself as an angel of light. Obviously reflecting upon the tradition that goes back to that Ugaritic myth where Ophtar is the shining Venus morning star. So now that morning star is associated with the angel of light. In my mind, I wonder about, and I've never researched this, at what point did this reference to the morning star as being something bad get associated with Jesus? I don't know. I just find that terribly interesting. That now when we use the language of morning star, who do we think of? We don't think of Satan. We think of Jesus. And then finally, Revelation 12 and 20, where the association is now finally made and only here between Satan and the snake in Eden, that ancient serpent. It's in the book of Revelation where we finally have that connection explicitly spelled out. I don't know if I want to deal with the well, I should probably talk about it a little bit because we've mentioned what the point of Genesis 2 and 3 is, according to my estimation, to tell us about the nature of the human condition. But in Christian tradition, obviously, the story has taken on rather dramatic new connotations. And I don't think this developed with Paul. I think that it was already in the Jewish air, to which Paul was himself heir. So in Romans chapter 5, Paul goes on this treatise talking about sin and death entering the human condition that was originally immortal. And so as sin enters into the human condition, so death enters. As though to say that prior to sin, there was no death. The original state was immortality. And this is basically then the Christian tradition on this. I think that this is also seen in the pseudepigraphal work of 2nd Esdras. And you laid on him, Adam, one commandment of yours, but he transgressed it, and immediately you appointed death for him and for his descendants, as though there was a time before death for the human condition. And then other texts from 2nd Esdras that point out the same thing. The disease becomes permanent. What was good departed, and only evil remained. The fall was not yours alone, O Adam, but ours also, who are your descendants. So this doctrine of original sin, I think, my opinion, is not something that was implied in the Genesis text. It is something that comes out of the later Jewish tradition and is carried over into the Christian tradition, and then given its sort of official stamp by Paul and others, especially St. Augustine. Okay, backwards. Nope. Help. What? I have an asterisk?
The book of the Bible you were just talking about.
Oh, Esdras. Yeah, I thought you were asterisk. Where's the asterisk up there? I can't get this bloody thing to work. There. Okay, Esdras is a pseudepigraphal work. Probably about the time of Jesus. Somewhere around 1st century before Christ, 1st century after Christ, maybe some of the later parts of it, 2nd century, but it shows the developing tradition. That Paul was not making this up. It wasn't Paul's idea alone, that Paul was heir to a developing Jewish tradition. Okay? The garden in Islamic tradition. And I'll try and make this quick. I was going to say 2, but it's too late for that. In the Islamic tradition, there is only one tree, but it offers neither immortality nor wisdom. Now, with regard to wisdom, recall that in the Islamic tradition, Adam is granted total knowledge, total wisdom immediately when God teaches Adam the names of everything. So there is nothing wrong with wisdom in the Islamic tradition. The tree is simply said by Iblis, the devil character, to be a tree of immortality. It's not. But God has already told Adam, for some reason, don't eat of that tree. Now, Islamic tradition isn't clear that I recall as to why God says that, but it's just one of the arbitrary commandments that God gives. Don't eat of that tree. It's not that it's off limits because it's going to offer either immortality or wisdom, but Iblis says it's going to offer immortality. But Iblis was lying. That's an explicit statement in the Quranic tradition. Iblis was lying. And so when Adam and Eve ate of the fruit, it didn't convey anything to them. They didn't become immortal. They didn't gain wisdom because they'd already been granted that. It simply showed that Adam was tricked by the devil to disobey God. And so that's a critical piece of the Islamic tradition. See, the point I want to make is that they know the tradition. What they knew about it may have been shaped by all of the traditions that accrued to the biblical tradition in those centuries between Muhammad and the early church. So wisdom is never an issue in the Quranic tradition. It's not seized by stealth. It's part of the human condition given to humans when God taught Adam all of the names. Recall, Adam is superior to the angels and the jinn, and this is the cause for Iblis's fall from heaven. And we already talked about Psalm 8, verses 4 through 5, that Adam, in the biblical tradition, is created just lower than God, Ma'at Melohim. In Hebrews, it gets worked over so that now Adam is demoted below the angels. And I find it interesting that he's promoted again in the Islamic tradition. Because in the Islamic tradition, you have God, you have the human, and you have angels. And the angels bow down to humans. In the Christian tradition, because of the way the text is translated in the New Testament, now all of a sudden, or in the Septuagint and carried over into the New Testament, now humans are demoted to below the angels. So just an interesting note. And there are all sorts of stories that are related to this. For example, if you did a search on the life of Adam and Eve, you might be interested in all of the literature that developed in the Christian tradition, Jewish and Christian traditions, about these stories of Adam and Eve. There were a plethora of these stories. Don't think that the biblical stories are the only ones that were known in the ancient world. By the time of Muhammad, there was a raft of stories having to do with Adam and Eve and all of the other characters, and we'll see this when we turn in our last session to the character of Jesus and the stories that developed by then. The consequence of the garden. That's the last one. How'd that get there already? The consequence of the garden, and I think this is the last slide. And this is important for Islamic theology. This is where the rubber hits the road for the difference between Christianity and Islam. In the Islamic tradition, Adam is duly warned by God. Do not eat of that tree. Now, in the biblical tradition, from Genesis, God certainly warns Adam, but in the day that you eat of it, you shall die. And the snake says, God was bluffing. God's just trying to protect the divine person because God knows full well that in the day you eat of it, you will become like God. And God doesn't want that. That's why God is telling you not to eat of it. And so that's when Eve sees that it's good to the sight and it tastes good to eat and it's guaranteed to bring wisdom. What else is she supposed to do? She takes of it and eats. So there's the warning, but the reader of the biblical text is left wondering, is God bluffing? Is the snake right? Well, the snake is right at one level, but as we've already talked about, at a deeper level, the snake is wrong, because what is it that they gain? They gain the knowledge that they are unique in creation because they are aware of their immortality. So there's that question about God's bluff in Genesis 3. But in the Quranic tradition, God is very clear. Do not eat of this tree. And warns Adam, this is what Iblis is going to do. Iblis is going to try and trick you into eating of that tree. Don't fall for it. Now, the fact that humans are clearly warned in the Quranic tradition, that's a part of the Islamic basis of Islamic theology, where God continually warns, and the prophets continually warned, and Muhammad understands himself to be a warner, that the notion of warning is very critical in Islamic thought and theology. Secondly, Adam and Eve in the Quranic tradition, this is critical, they repent. There's no notice of their repentance in the biblical tradition. But in the Quranic tradition, they repent And even more important, they become exemplary models of Muslim piety. No one in the Christian tradition is going to look at Adam and Eve as being exemplary models of anything. They're going to be regarded, according to Paul and Christian tradition in general, as the guilty ones who brought this mess upon us. But in Islamic theology, they are understood to have repented and therefore become models of exemplary Muslim piety. And then lastly, in Islamic theology, there is no lasting consequence of the story of Adam and Eve's offense. There is a strict rejection in Islamic theology of any doctrine of original sin. Probably because Islamic theology is very focused on rejecting the Christian fundamental theological conviction that Jesus' death and resurrection is intended to deliver us in the midst of our own helplessness. In Islamic theology, there's a rejection of that because Islamic theology insists that you have been warned by God, you have free will to do good in this life, and if you make a mess, it's your responsibility to clean it up. There is no need in Islamic theology of a savior figure to redeem you from your brokenness and to make it all better. You make it better with God's help. Now, that's often misunderstood in Islamic theology also, that God is gracious and merciful. Every surah begins with, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. And God bends over backwards to assist you, but ultimately it's up to you to clean up the mess that you make. And God's is a bookkeeper, sort of, in terms of counting sins, but God's a very generous bookkeeper and is quite willing to look the other way or to give you all sorts of advantages in order to balance those books. So this is, I think, critical in Islamic theology when you look at those stories of Adam and Eve. Okay, that took a little longer probably. Well, 2:30. We have a half an hour. We had a half an hour last week, so good. Half an hour. That's all I wanted to talk about. Rest, break, breathe. Questions or comments?
So, if Muslim tradition indicated that Adam and Eve gained knowledge,
They gained knowledge because God granted them knowledge. God taught them the names of everything.
okay, so why is it today that in Islam or certain areas of Islam, they don't want women to have knowledge?
Oh, that's way beyond my pay grade. That has to do with cultural assumptions that many Muslims, most Muslims in the world would probably say are not a part of Islam. You have to distinguish between the basic Islamic theology and assumptions and the cultural assumptions made by some fundamentalist groups, such as in Afghanistan, that don't want women to have a significant role outside the home. That's a cultural thing. I think most Muslims would say. And they would say that's wrong. They're wrong. So if you went to Indonesia, if you went to Jordan, if you went to Egypt, Syria, even Syria, in most places, you'll find women that are highly educated, that are political leaders, that are fully engaged in work in the world. But among rural areas and very conservative countries like Afghanistan and maybe some areas of Pakistan, you'll find hard going for women. But that's the exception. That's really the exception. Yeah.
In our biblical tradition, Eve is of Adam from his rib.
Yeah. Well, in Genesis, sorry?
In Quranic tradition, is Eve just there?
There, that's interesting. I would find it fairly easy to argue that in some ways Islam, at least in terms of these texts, has a much more gracious attitude about women. And I'm sure Muslims would argue that. Many Muslims would argue that, whether rightly or wrongly. But we have the story in Genesis 2 where Eve is made from Adam's rib. But Genesis 1 gives us a different story. But certainly that whole thing of, what would you call a misogynistic method of interpreting biblical texts, the Old Testament, I don't think, was nearly as guilty of that as the Christian tradition has been. We still have to struggle with that misogynist tradition in Christian interpretation. Other questions? Yes, back in the back.
So what do Muslims believe about why we die and what happens to us afterwards?
Yeah, that's a good question because I don't know that any of my text will get at that. What do Muslims believe about why we die and what happens afterwards? Well, I think they would probably say why we die is because we're human. And there's no sense in the Islamic tradition that an original state of immortality was tragically disrupted by Adam's sin. That's not part of Islamic interpretation. That comes through Jewish and Christian interpretation, but Islam resisted that. And there is no original sin. We don't die because of original sin. We die because we're human. And like I tried to lay out in the Genesis 3 text, there never was the understanding in Genesis 3 that we were originally immortal and that death came in because of Adam's sin. That's a later reinterpretation. What happens to us afterwards, exactly the same sorts of conversations as developed in Christian tradition. Last week, I think I mentioned that one of the things that Islam insists upon as a part of your faith is belief in the day of judgment. You have to believe in angels, which is kind of weird. You have to believe that Muhammad is the one who reveals the divine word, and you have to believe in the day of judgment. And you can't read the Quranic tradition without being aware of how focused Islam is on that particular belief. There's a resurrection. They very strong statement about accepting the belief in the resurrection of the dead. And so they follow the Jewish Christian development of that tradition. Naturally, they spin it in their own way, but they follow the tradition.
So is their resurrection based on their works?
The resurrection is your residency in paradise, let's say, after you die, is based upon your working out the divine will in your life. You're doing good works, but also, as I indicated, under the auspices of a judging God who wants the daylights for you to enjoy paradise and will bend over backwards to help you make that work out. But you can screw up. And if you do, then there are untold sorts of punishments waiting for the unbelievers. But that's not so different than traditional Christian understanding, We have to admit that our view of eternal punishment hasn't been so benign. But so it's very close to Christian and Jewish understanding of hell. Yeah?
Will you be doing a discussion of Isaac and Esau at some point?
Yeah, well, when I deal with Abraham.
Okay.
Right. Can't do with Abraham without doing with Isaac and Jacob and Esau. And especially Esau, he's critical.
What did he ask you?
Oh, will I be dealing with the patriarchal stories, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Esau, because Esau is an important character. Because Muhammad traces the Arabic tradition through Esau. No, I'm sorry, not Esau, through Ishmael. But Esau also is important, but not as important as Ishmael. Yes?
It is the same God, correct?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I'm not going to try and identify God. I'm Jewish in that regard. I have no business talking about God. I leave the O with a hyphen when I spell G-D. But Muslims would say that, yeah, they understand this to be the same God. The God that is revealed in Judaism and in Christianity. It's just that Jews and Christians got some things wrong. And Muhammad understands himself to be a reformer who is trying to weed out the wrong things and get back to what God intended.
But their God didn't have a son, Jesus.
Well, Jesus is a very important character, as we'll see in our last session. Jesus is a very important character, but Jesus is not considered to be divine, because that would be a flagrant violation of the rule against association.
So they didn't believe in the same.
Oh, that's one of the critical differences between Islam and Christianity specifically, is a denial of the divinity of Jesus. Jesus can't be divine. But remember, the Christian community was also struggling with those sorts of issues, and some insisting on the difference between Jesus and God, and denying Jesus' divinity, strictly speaking. So it's not that Islam's so far out in left field. They were following arguments that had been going on for centuries. But right, that one of the major differences between Judaism too, and Islam on one hand and Christianity on the other, is our claims about the divinity of Jesus. Right. But Jesus was an important prophet in Islam. Born of a virgin. Holy mackerel. Muslims will outdo me in terms of their fidelity to belief in the virginity of Mary. Born of a virgin, a prophet, but not divine.
So how could he not be divine if he was born of a virgin?
Got me. How could he be divine if he not be divine if he were born of a virgin? That's one of the great mysteries, and I don't know. I'm sure that many Muslims would be happy to talk about that, but they have a very fond devotion to the virginity of Mary, as we'll see. Yes. Yes.
Is that where the word infidel? Where is the word infidel?
Infidel? Well, I don't know. You're going to put me through my paces in terms of word recognition. Fide is faith, and in probably is a reversal of that. So infidel probably comes from one who is against the faith or lacks faith or something. It's not the Muslim expression. They have their own expressions for one who does not believe. Can't remember what they are offhand, but they have several of them. Other questions? We still have time. We have, 15 minutes? 20 minutes, almost 20 minutes. So I've raised a number of what I would expect are unsettling observations. I don't know how unsettled you are, and I don't claim that I'm right on all of this stuff. I think one of the most unsettling comments that I've made would have to do with my interpretation of the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, and how it was never intended at the primary level to talk about how it is that death came into the human condition, because according to the story that I read, we were always mortal, And the only change was that we made it to the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and we became like God in knowing everything. So we have the mind of God, but we were never understood to be immortal. Now the problem is, that's not the way Paul reads it. By the time you get to Paul, it's reversed. So that an original condition of immortality, according to Paul, and I think he's not making this up, he's following Jewish tradition that developed later. According to Paul, our original immortality was disrupted when they ate of the fruit and death entered the human condition for the first time. And I'm not insisting that people follow me in that thought. That's just my own thinking that I share with you, and I could be dead wrong. I hope I'm not deadly wrong. Yes. Oh.
Doesn't Paul also say in Corinthians that we will judge the angels when you talk about the different?
Oh, I hadn't even thought of that. That's interesting. Didn't Paul know that we were created lower than the angels? I hadn't even made that connection. I'm woefully unprepared to make a comment on it, except that I find it interesting that Paul would say that. Well, I mean, at that point, Paul could be following the original Hebrew text of Psalms that says, I've made you little less than God. So
review that original sin again.
the point that I was making,
Point that you-
okay, that according to my understanding and the way I read the tradition in Genesis 2 and 3, the story attempts to tell us about the human condition, why we experience, how we experience ourselves as human. We experience ourselves as human because, number one, we recognize that we have the mind of God. But number two, that mind of God is wrapped in this mortal body that I know is going to die. And that's the human condition. And so Genesis 2 and 3 attempts to spin a story to explain how that came about. We made it to the tree of knowledge of good and evil. We never made it to the tree of life. Now, let me add that in this regard, there are several other stories in ancient Near Eastern mythology that have similar motifs. For example, I mentioned last week the story of Utnapishtim, who is the Babylonian Noah. And Gilgamesh goes to Utnapishtim to find out his secret to immortality because Utnapishtim has been granted with immortality. And so Gilgamesh shows up, pleads with Utnapishtim, who tells Gilgamesh, well, okay, there's this bush down at the bottom of this lake. Swim down there, get that bush, and you'll have immortality. And so Gilgamesh gets it. But by the time he gets it back on land and gets cleaned up, the snake has crawled off with the bush and sheds its skin. As a story, I think, again, trying to clarify why is it that humans never had immortality? Why do we experience ourselves as mortal? A similar story is the Adapa legend, an ancient, probably Sumerian legend that is passed back and forth through the ancient Near East, in which there is this character who's all-knowing, named Adapa, regarded as a human heroic figure. And he's all-knowing, all-wise, but he offends one of the gods by breaking the wing of the east wind or the south wind or whatever it is. And so he's called on the carpet by the god who is angry at him for having done this. But another god warns Adapa, when you go before that other god, don't drink the water and don't eat the food that god is going to offer you. So Adapa goes before the god, called on the carpet. He is offered bread and water, but he refuses to eat. And the God tells him, oh, shoot, too bad, because I just offered you the bread and water of life. And so a couple of stories that I think are characteristic of that worldview that tried to clarify why is it that we humans understand ourselves to be mortal. And in both of those cases, in the one case, Adapa was misled by being told by another god, don't drink that water or eat that bread. And in another case, by the snake crawling off with it and having immortality instead. So I take the Genesis 2 and 3 text in the similar vein, that this is a story that attempts to tell us why we understand ourselves to be mortal. We never made it to the tree of life. But obviously that grates against our Christian tradition, and so when I read the Christian texts, I have to struggle with that too. And I understand the polarity involved in that, and I can appreciate both sides of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Yeah.
So our bodies are mortal, and the human is mortal. But is the Holy Spirit mortal?
Show me where the term Holy Spirit is used in Genesis 2 and 3, and I'd be willing to consider it. That's a later development that comes in where you get the human being divided up into spirit and soul and body and all of that. Good question for theological reflection. It's not part of my knowledge. Yes?
So in Christianity, we have people who believe that the Garden of Eden it existed just exactly literally as it was told, and others who see that this is an allegory. It's a story of explanation. Is that true in the Muslim faith as well?
Oh, yeah, I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is. I don't think that, although Islam, my limited experience, Islam tends to be much more conservative in its theological views, I have met Muslims who are very thoughtful. And I'm sure that Muslim scholars debate these same sorts of issues. But there are a lot of fundamentalist Muslims out there. A lot of Christians who would fight and die for the literalness of these stories. And that's okay. We're all entitled to our position. Other comments, questions? Well, next week, what are we going to do? I think we're going to look at Noah. And that's another interesting story. All sorts of interesting twists in that one. Noah and the universal flood. So we're a little early, 10 minutes, 9 minutes, but no sense holding you captive. So thank you very much for your time and consideration.